We've been talking a lot about The Witcher 3 lately, and I thought it was time to talk about the real game in The Witcher 3, and that's Gwent. Gwent has had a lot of subtle changes since the game's original launch, with some introduction of new cards as well as a new faction, so for today we're going to go through all of it in my Gwent guide.
Herbs schmerbs. But how about some Gwent, eh?
Let me know in the comments your favorite Gwent faction. We'll start with the basics, and I won't go too deep into like the general basic stuff because that hasn't really changed since the game came out, but Gwent is a game about risk versus reward. Is it too risky to play this card now, or should I wait until the next round? The main basics of Gwent are simple, but they leave a lot of room for complexity and some kind of strategy building. At the beginning of each game, you and your opponent will draw 10 cards. For the most part, those 10 cards and only those 10 cards will be the cards you'll use for every round of the game, and there'll be 3 rounds in each game. Your hand will usually consist of the combat cards, which will be placed in one of the 3 rows: close combat, range combat, or siege combat. You'll have weather cards as well as special cards. A coin is flipped to determine who goes first, and the game is afoot. The player with the highest amount of total power after both players have passed for that round wins that specific round. You will need to win 2 rounds out of the 3 to actually win the game. The power levels on the cards themselves can be affected by weather cards to reduce their power, or buffed by things like the Commander Horn to double the power in that row. The balance here really is deciding when to play those cards, in what order to play those cards, and to get the most total power in 2 of the 3 rounds in order to win. That's the basics. Now let's get into some of the nitty gritty stuff. So we already covered the combat rows. Let's talk about card abilities. Certain cards will have these little icons next to them indicating that they are some kind of ability or effect that they can do. There was additional abilities and effects added into the game with the Skellig deck as well as with the Hearts of Stone. So let's go through the abilities. Agile cards can be placed in either the ranged combat or the close combat row, and once they are placed, they cannot be moved for the remainder of the game. Medic cards will allow you to choose one card from your discard pile and play it instantly, except for heroes and special cards. This allows you to summon cards from previous rounds or cards that may have been destroyed by Scorch. Morale boost cards add +1 strength to all units in that specific row that they have been played, except for themselves. Muster cards will automatically find any cards with the same name in your deck and your hand and play them instantly. If you are carrying a lot of muster cards, you want to make sure you've only got one of them in your hand so you don't remove too many cards from your hand at once. Spire cards are probably the most OP card in the game, and they will be placed on the opponent's battlefield and count towards their total. However, it will allow you to draw 2 additional cards. Now, as we've already discussed, you only draw 10 cards at the start of a game. The more Spire cards you have will then allow you to draw more cards, and essentially, the more cards you have, the higher your percentage chance of winning the game is. Tight Bond is another ability. When placed next to a card with the same name, it will double the strength of both or even more of those cards. And the last kind of uniqueness to the cards is the hero cards. Now, these are specific types of cards that can't be summoned or affected by things like Scorch or Commander's Horn. Whatever the effect is, that is static and won't be changed by any of the other special cards that can be played. That is all the card abilities, but cards can also be affected by different special cards like weather cards that can be played to add different effects, as well as cards will have some of these effects on them just via their own nature. We already touched on weather cards briefly, but the weather cards like Biting Frost or Impenetrable Fog will affect the specific row that they are for and set the strength of those cards to 1. It is possible to manipulate that 1 strength to increase it in various ways, but across the board, for the most part, that is what the weather cards do, other than Clear Weather, which will clear all of the weather effects. Commander's Horn will double the strength of all of the cards in that selected row. You can also see Commander's Horn on specific cards like Dandelion as well, and in those cases, you can't change the row that they are summoning on, but you can with the actual Commander Horn card. The Decoy card will swap any regular card on your side of the battlefield and return it to the hand and play the decoy in its place. This is a great way to combine with something like a medic, so you can get double the value of, say, a medic summoning cards into your hand, or even pulling a spire that the opponent used into your hand so then you can play it back to them. Scorch cards will kill the strongest card or cards on the battlefield. This will also affect you or your opponent as well. So say if everyone on the battlefield has a huge amount of power 6 cards, they will all get destroyed via this one Scorch card. There were also a couple of unique effects that were added with the DLCs. The first is the Summon Avenger. There's only a couple of these cards, but what they do is practically nothing until they are removed from the battlefield. So say if you play them on the first turn, and then after that turn when they remove to the discard pile, it will summon a card in its place. This card that is summoned in its place is usually pretty powerful, so it is worth having these cards in your deck if they do fit within your theme. And the last is the Berserker and Mad Jerome kind of combo. So the Berserker ability will transform those cards into a bear if the Mad Madrome card is in its row. And the Madrome card will essentially just trigger those Berserker effects. Madrome can also be found on Ermium, the hero card itself, but there is also a special card that can be played on that row, same as like how you would a Command Horn, and it will change those cards to be bears, which are much more powerful than just the initial Berserker or young Berserker types. Now, one of the hardest decisions you'll make is picking a faction. Each faction really has a strength and a weakness and a general theme of like what that faction is about. Initially, you'll start with the Northern Realms if you're starting the game from scratch. And Northern Realms is definitely the easiest to play and get a grasp of, especially with the high amount of spy cards in that deck. But let's go through each of the 5 factions so you can kind of have a general idea of how each plays. Monster decks have the ability to keep a random unit card out after each round, and monster decks really focus on the muster mechanic. So you find any cards with the same name in your deck and play them instantly, like we talked about earlier. You will have a ton of these cards in this deck, and this deck is really one of the only decks where you want to have as many cards in your deck as possible so you can summon a ton of cards, as well as using things like Commander Horn to really maximize the amount of strength you have on the battlefield. Nilfgaard decks focus on high power standalone cards, special cards, and spies for the most part. They are a great progression if you started with Northern Realms and looking to try something else. The ability for Nilfgaard decks will have you win any round that ends in a draw. So if you do draw with the opponent, you'll just instantly win that round as a Nilfgaard deck. Nilfgaard decks have a lot of high power cards that don't really have any special effects on them. So that's really the balance there, is you might have like a card that has 10 strength, but it doesn't have any kind of special effects, say like being a medic or something like that. Northern Realms is the easiest deck and the one that you start with. Now, the ability here will grant you an extra card upon winning a round. So when you win a round, you just get an extra card, and we've already discussed how good that is. Northern Realm really focuses on siege units as well as the tight bond mechanic. So tight bond, when you've got 2 cards of the same name, you double the strength of their power. There are also a lot of spy cards here, same as the Nilfgaard deck, so you can summon a lot of those cards into your hand and then combine them with tight bond to actually put them out onto the battlefield. Scoia'tael decks are focused on the agile mechanic, so agility cards that can be placed in either the ranged or closed combat row, which gives you a lot of flexibility depending on, say, if you're playing a monster deck which like to use a lot of close combat, you can play them in ranged and then play something like the Bited Frost, something like that. But the ability here will allow you to decide who takes the first turn. In most cases, you want to set that as your opponent so that they're drawing cards and putting them down first. The Skellige deck was added with the Blood and Wine DLC, and the ability here will summon 2 random cards from the graveyard to be placed on the battlefield at the start of the 3rd round. And a lot of their cards are really focused on that Berserk mechanic, which we touched on earlier, as well as things like Tight Bond, and essentially just like outlasting the opponent because you get the ability to summon those cards from your graveyard as well. So really unique compared to the other different decks. The big question is, how do you get new cards? The first thing I'll tell you is to go to Novigrad and pick up the Miraculous Guide to Gwent book. There is a gentleman here who will sell you this book, and it'll essentially tell you how many cards are left that you need to get, either from random just like scrubs that you can fight against with Gwent, or actual like unique cards and the regions that they are from. Now, the random scrubs that you will fight, you can only win 1 card from each opponent, and after that they'll just give you like a random thing. The card you win is random, drawn from like the selection of just like random cards. Most vendors and merchants will be able to play against with Gwent, and certain merchants, especially innkeepers, will actually sell you Gwent cards as well, so make sure you're checking those inventories to actually buy Gwent cards. It's a great way to actually get an abundance of cards, especially in the early game when you're just trying to like get good cards for Gwent. The best way to do that is to go to innkeepers and merchants and actually just buy cards so that you can actually beat the players that you're trying to fight against with Gwent. And there is also a bunch of missable cards that are linked to the different quest lines in the game. I'll throw up a list here of the different quests that you may want to pay attention to that will have unique cards involved in them. I wasn't really sure if I should break these down directly or just like tell you the names of the quests, because if you haven't played the game before, I don't want to spoil anything for you, but these are the names of the quests and the general area that they're from, so you can go and do those. We've covered a bunch of tips and tricks just throughout this video, but the one thing we haven't talked about really is like deck building tips. Now, for basically every deck, you want to have the lowest amount of cards possible that will still allow you to play. A good barometer is if you've got more than 30 cards in your deck, it's probably too many. You want to have lower than that, and trying to fit between around 6 special cards and the rest being the unit cards and a couple of hero cards. You don't want to go too heavy on hero cards because they can't be interacted with any of the other different effects. Now, the only exception to this really comes in the monster decks, because they are based around that muster mechanic and summoning cards from your deck onto the field. So you want to, for a monster deck, just have like an abundance of cards in your deck really as much as possible. But the best advice really is to just experiment with these different decks and cards, and when you are like challenging people and betting, you can just bet like 1 crown, so you're not really losing anything if you do lose, and you can just keep battling them again, as you never actually lose cards. So there isn't much of a penalty for losing and experimenting. So obviously experiment as much as you can. Just be careful about experimenting when you're doing a Gwent quest, because some of those are failable. You want to make sure you don't do that. The last thing you want to pay attention to is your leader cards. Each of the factions will have a unique leader that will be based around its specific mechanics. Say for Northern Realms, it is the siege kind of based around siege cards and the weather cards. You really want to find whichever one of these works best for you. There is probably one, more or less one, I would say, in each of the factions that is the best, and I'm kind of showing you it here now. But for the most part, it is really dependent on what the deck you are using and what you're trying to look for in the build that you are making. And that is Gwent, my guys. Let me know in the comments your favorite Gwent faction. Thanks for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Nozer, and I hope you have a great day.